Welcome back, everyone, to the Deep Dive. This time, we're diving headfirst into England's Industrial Revolution. But not just any old overview. We're zeroing in on how those colonies across the pond, well, they weren't just sipping tea and minding their own business, right? They played a huge part in this whole economic shakeup. And get this, we've got textbooks, lesson plans, you name it, a real smorgasbord of sources to sift through.
It's quite a mix, isn't it?
It is. But don't worry, folks, we'll cut through the clutter.
Absolutely. We'll highlight the most eye-catching bits.
The juicy details, the insights that'll make you go, aha.
You'll leave this deep dive with a crystal clear understanding of this world-changing period. Trust me.
Okay, so before we get to all those steam engines and factories, England's already got this sprawling empire. What was the scene like in their American colonies before the Industrial Revolution really kicked off?
Well, you gotta remember, the American colonies weren't exactly a one-size-fits-all situation. Up north, you had settlements mainly focused on farming, some trade, even a bit of industry starting to bubble up. But head down south, and it's a whole different ballgame.
Okay.
Plantations, massive ones, just churning out cash crops like there's no tomorrow. Tobacco, cotton, you name it.
Yes. The plantation system. Can't talk about that without mentioning the elephant in the room there, either.
Yeah.
Transatlantic slave trade. That had to have left a mark on the economic landscape, didn't it?
Oh, absolutely. You can't separate the two. Those plantations needed a workforce, and a massive one at that. That's where that horrific triangular trade comes in. And the Royal African Company, they were granted a charter in the elite 1600s. And, well, let's just say they played a key role in supplying enslaved Africans to the colonies. It's a dark period. No way around it.
It is a grim chapter for sure. But here's the thing. Even with all that going on, there's this growing opposition to slavery brewing. Wasn't that around the time the abolitionist movement started gaining steam?
Yeah, it was. You had people driven by their faith, by Enlightenment ideals. They were starting to question the very morality of the slave trade. Talk about the power of ideas, right? And the fight for basic human rights. That's a thread that runs through history.
It does. Okay, so we've got this complicated colonial backdrop. But what was it that actually lit the fuse for the Industrial Revolution back in England itself? Was it just a sudden burst of genius, or was something else simmering beneath the surface?
It was a whole bunch of factors coming together, really. You had improvements in agriculture, disease control. People were living longer, healthier, population.
More mouths to feed, more bodies to clothe. Classic supply and demand.
Exactly. And on top of that, you have this wave of groundbreaking innovations, like the spinning jenny. Ever heard of it?
Rings a bell.
This thing, it let one worker spin like a gazillion threads at once.
Yeah.
Production went through the roof.
Wow. Okay. And then comes the big one, right? The steam engine. Game changer.
Oh, totally. James Watt, he tinkers with the steam engine in the late 1700s, and boom, reliable power. The kind of power you need to fuel factories, mass production. It's a whole new world.
Okay, so we've got the people, the demand, the technology. But where do the colonies fit into all of this? They weren't just sitting pretty on the sidelines, were they?
No way. Those savvy entrepreneurs, they saw those profits rolling in from their colonial ventures and thought, hey, let's plow that right back into these new industries popping up back home.
Smart move.
Right. And that influx of cash is like rocket fuel for factories, infrastructure, the whole shebang. Industrialization goes into overdrive.
So the colonies were basically bankrolling England's industrial engine.
In a sense, yeah. But it wasn't just about the money. Think raw materials. Cotton especially. It was flowing in from the Caribbean, the U.S., India, all feeding those hungry textile mills back in England.
Hold on. India. So they weren't just a source of raw materials, but also a massive market for those finished goods.
You got it. England's churning out products like crazy, and India, with its huge population, well, they became a prime market for all those textiles. It's a complicated relationship, though, you know. Colonizer colony. A lot of power dynamics at play. Yeah, there's a whole other side to this story, you know. It wasn't just about economics. Real people were caught up in this whirlwind.
Right. It's easy to get lost in the big picture.
Yeah.
But what about the everyday folks? How did this industrialization actually impact their lives, both in England and in the colonies?
Well, in England, as those factories were popping up everywhere, you see this new social class emerging. The factory worker.
Yep.
And a lot of these folks, they were driven from rural areas, some by hardship, some because of land enclosure. They'd lost their farms, you see.
Makes sense.
So they flocked to these booming industrial cities, Manchester, Birmingham, places like that, desperate for work.
I bet life in those cities was a far cry from the peaceful countryside. What were conditions like in those places?
It was rough. Think cramped housing, terrible sanitation, long hours toiling away in dangerous factories, and the pollution from all that coal-powered machinery. Forget about it. The air was thick with smoke. It was a breeding ground for social problems, poverty, inequality, you name it.
So people weren't just sitting back and taking it, I imagine. There had to be some pushback against these conditions, right?
Oh, there was. Big time. You couldn't ignore what they called the social question. It was all anyone was talking about. Reformers, activists, they started speaking out, demanding better working conditions, limits on child labor, government intervention to protect the most vulnerable.
Did those calls for reform actually lead to any real change? Or was it all just talk?
No, they did make some headway. In 1833, after years of campaigning, they passed the Factory Act.
Factory acts, okay.
These were huge. They aimed to regulate child labor, limit the hours kids could work, make sure they got at least some basic education. And they even set up a system of factory inspection to make sure everyone was playing by the rules.
Sounds like a step in the right direction. But I bet the factory owners weren't exactly throwing a party. Weren't they worried about their bottom line?
Oh, they pushed back for sure. They argued that government interference would stifle economic growth, mess with the whole free trade thing. But the reformers, they were persistent, and they started gaining more public support as word got out about just how bad things were for those factory workers.
It's inspiring, though, right? To see people fighting for social justice, even amidst all that economic and technological change. Were there any standout figures in this fight for workers' rights?
One guy who really stands out is Robert Owen. He was a textile mill owner himself, but he took a pretty radical approach.
Oh,
He believed that if you treated workers better, gave them decent housing education for their kids, shorter working hours, well, everyone would benefit. Productivity would go up. Society would be more harmonious.
wait a minute. A factory owner who actually cared about his workers. Now, that's not a story you hear every day about the Industrial Revolution.
Yeah, Owen was kind of an anomaly. He put his money where his mouth was, though. At his mill in New Lanark, Scotland, he put all these ideas into practice. And you know what? It worked. People were paying attention. He inspired other reformers. He showed that treating people with dignity and respect wasn't some pipe dream. It could actually go hand in hand with industrial success.
It's a good reminder that even when things are changing like crazy, there are always people pushing for a fairer, more just world. But while we've been focusing on the social side of things, didn't England also experience massive economic growth during this period? I mean, they became like the envy of the world.
Oh, yeah. The Industrial Revolution catapulted England to a whole new level. They were producing goods on a scale never seen before, and the whole world wanted what they were selling. This economic boom created a ton of wealth, especially for those industrialists who were at the top of the food chain.
And the cities themselves, they must have changed drastically with all this growth.
Absolutely. Cities like Manchester, Birmingham, London, they just exploded in size. New factories, railroads, canals, all connecting raw materials, factories, and markets across the country. And London, well, it cemented its place as a global financial powerhouse. Banks, insurance companies, investors, they all wanted a piece of the action.
It sounds like one giant whirlwind of change and innovation. Was there any particular event or moment that really captured England's newfound industrial power?
Well, the Great Exhibition of 1851, have you heard of it?
Vaguely.
They held it in London in this incredible building called the Crystal Palace. It was like a giant World's Fair, a showcase for all of England's industrial achievements. You had all these technological marvels, manufactured goods from across the British Empire, all on display. People came from all over the world to see it. It was a defining moment. England was officially the workshop of the world.
I can only imagine the spectacle.
Yeah.
But every empire eventually faces challenges, right? And the Industrial Revolution brought some new players onto the world stage. Could England really maintain its dominance with all these new competitors breathing down their necks?
Ah, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And it opens up a whole new chapter in this story. Well, as we moved into the late 1800s, things started to shift. England had some serious competition on its hands.
Oh, who were the contenders?
The U.S., Germany, they were coming up fast, adopting new technologies, building their own industrial empires. They wanted a piece of that global market.
So it's like the new kids on the block challenging the old guard. How did England react to that?
They did what empires tend to do, I guess. Doubled down.
Double down on what?
Their empire. They went looking for new markets, new sources of raw materials, expanded their reach even further into Africa, Asia, you name it. By 1900, they controlled a quarter of the world's population.
A quarter? That's mind-boggling. But running an empire that massive must have taken its toll, both on England and the people they were colonizing.
Oh, absolutely. You need a huge military, a whole bureaucracy to manage that. And ethically speaking, well, there are a lot of questions there, right? Imposing their rule, their economic systems on all these different cultures and societies is a complicated legacy.
It is. So as we wrap up this deep dive into England's Industrial Revolution, what's the big takeaway here? What should our listeners be thinking about?
Well, I think the main thing is that the Industrial Revolution wasn't just about shiny new machines and making tons of money. It's about global connections, how industrialization, colonialism, the lives of everyday people, all these things are intertwined. You can't look at one without the others.
It's a reminder that history isn't always neat and tidy, right? It's messy, complicated, full of contradictions. You've given us a lot to think about. Especially that question of, did the Industrial Revolution really benefit England more than its colonies? Or did it create this web of interdependence where everyone's fate was kind of tied together?
That's the question, isn't it? It's tempting to just focus on the progress, the innovation, but we can't forget the downsides. Exploitation, inequality, the impact on the environment, that's all part of the story too.
For sure. Well, on that note, we've come to the end of our deep dive into England's Industrial Revolution. Hope you enjoyed the journey, folks, and learned a thing or two along the way. And as always, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep learning. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave us a comment. Catch you next time.